hadn't been homeschooling very long when I realized how lucky I was to have had a lot of experience with evaluations. Now, you might be thinking, well, how can that be hard? And a lot of homeschoolers really do not recognize the importance of evaluations. Evaluations can nurture growth, they can empower a learner to feel confident, and they can, done well, they can be a profound catalyst for growth with their academic work. Welcome to This is Homeschooling. I'm your host, Blair Lee. There we go. Evaluations are powerful catalysts for growth. By providing insights, feedback, and scaffolding, they empower students and educators, optimizing the learning process. That sounds great, doesn't it? But let's be honest, evaluating work is hard to do, especially when the academic work is done by your own child. Speaking of your own child, many of them feel any feedback as criticism and they shut down around your messaging. If that's the case, I recommend you work to find your confidence and to shift the dynamic, because it's worth getting this right. Thoughtful evaluations truly are one of the most powerful tools an educator has for nurturing the growth of learners. For the purpose of this talk, it's helpful to use one word for all the many iterations that evaluations can take, including assessment, grading, testing, and feedback. When I use the word evaluations, I am referring to any situation in which a child is expected to learn something and then they receive feedback on what they're learning. This can be as substantial as a research paper or an exam, or as small in scope as a single math problem or how to spell the word necessary, which I still struggle with today. Your evaluative process should be consistent with your philosophy of how learning best happens. Listen to that. That's because it is a practical manifestation of that philosophy for your learners. I want to repeat that. Your evaluative process should be consistent with your philosophy of how learning best happens. That's because it's a practical manifestation of that philosophy for your learners. Whew. That's actually really profound if you think about it. As an example, because of my philosophy about how learning best happens, I work to make evaluations learner-centered and growth-focused with a combination of task-oriented and holistic approach. I'll explain what those are in a minute. As you listen to this talk, I encourage you to think about how you can use those strategies that resonate with you so that your evaluations nurture your learner in a way that answers these questions. Does your evaluative process align with your beliefs about how learning happens best? Does your evaluative process help identify specific areas for support or enrichment tailored to your child's unique learning needs? Does your evaluative process foster a sense of responsibility and agency in children regarding their own learning journey? Because homeschoolers often lack experience with it, evaluating their child's work can feel like uncharted territory, causing nerves about how to do it. If that's you, think about this. As I already mentioned, homeschooling educators are in a better position than educators in a classroom to evaluate in a way that nurtures the growth of every learner. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is that evaluating a cohort of 20 to 30 learners lends itself to a mono approach where there is one standard for all. And sometimes as homeschooling parents, we fall into this trap. The second reason homeschoolers are in a better position to evaluate for growth has to do with time constraints and the need to get through the material, which creates a graded and done mentality where students don't receive targeted instruction on areas they missed, with the opportunity to resubmit their work so that they learn the material they needed more time with. Finally, the incredibly high investment that homeschoolers focus on their children lends itself to a willingness to adapt our evaluative processes in a way that benefits learners. I've been an educator for over 3 decades. During that span, I've given a lot of thought about the evaluative process. It's something that if you get right, it can be a powerful catalyst for growth. On the other extreme, if you don't get it right, it can cause kids to shut down or become surly. That can make you nervous about evaluating because you don't want to create a situation where your child is surly or shuts down. So one of the most important factors that you can bring to make it more likely that you succeed when evaluating work is your mindset. The more effectively you channel a growth mindset as a guiding principle for effective learning, the more likely it is that your evaluations will catalyze growth. Before going further, I want you to have a visual. Evaluations provide a snapshot of where a learner currently stands. That's what they do, like the larger pin in the center. Like a map, evaluations offer valuable insights into where it makes sense to go next and what might need adjusting to reach learning goals. They're no bigger or smaller than that. By thinking of evaluations as a roadmap that tells you where a learner is right now, you can analyze the information, recalibrate your approach if needed, and chart a revised course. Or they might provide the insight that you're on the right path, or you need to keep going, but at an accelerated pace. If evaluations are a practical manifestation of your philosophy for learning, the starting place is to know big picture why you're evaluating your learner's work. What's the purpose? I don't mean small picture by this. I mean big picture. And yes, I know that this is basically a white slide. That's because I don't want to tell you what your philosophy should be. I want you to take the next 15 seconds and jot down your response to this. What is the purpose, your purpose, when you evaluate your learner's work? Big picture. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, how effective are your evaluations at achieving this? Oops, click too soon. So be fair. 1 is, I need to work on this. 10 is, I'm doing pretty good. Notice 1 is, I need to work on this. Total growth mindset there, everyone. Okay, be fair with your response. All right. You get to the end of a chapter in math and there's a quiz. You don't think your learner has mastered the concepts or material. What do? A, give your child the test in the hopes that you're wrong about how well they learned the material. B, make a casual assessment and try to determine where the holes in understanding are, providing tutoring before having your child take the test. C, skip the test and go on to the next chapter's material. I want you to be honest with yourself about which one of those 3 you would choose. You can probably guess that if you're using evaluations to nurture growth, the answer is B. A purposeful evaluation assesses understanding, and it isn't given before there is some understanding of the material. Administering evaluations when learners lack understanding can have a detrimental effect on their self-confidence. It can reinforce feelings of inadequacy and create unnecessary pressure to perform. An evaluation where a learner does understand the material is a positive experience. If you've ever heard the saying, it's called learning, not knowing, recognize that evaluations are simply a diagnostic tool for assessing where more learning is needed and where knowing, aka age and stage appropriate mastery, has been achieved or hasn't been achieved. In situations where learners are still grappling with material, especially those focused on foundational concepts, it's important to prioritize instructional support and guidance rather than evaluation. If you're unsure whether your child's work is ready to be evaluated, ask them questions that check for understanding. And you can do that orally, in writing, whatever you think is the best mode for figuring that out. This doesn't mean you only evaluate when there is mastery, however. When you evaluate with a growth mindset, you're giving learners growth-oriented evaluations where you use the evaluation as a diagnostic tool. If you suspect your learner has a partial understanding of the material, an evaluation can help you and your learner identify the specific areas of understanding that need more targeted instruction. This allows you to address a learner's individual needs effectively. But if you use an evaluation for that, you need to be very careful that you're not negative about the things that they miss, because it's actually really a diagnostic tool to help you figure out what to do next is really a positive thing for you to have. Time constraints and the need to get through the material, as I mentioned earlier, can create a graded and done mentality where students do not receive targeted instruction on areas they missed, with the opportunity to resubmit their work so they can learn the material they needed more time with. Now, I brought that in from an earlier slide because I really want to highlight the phrase I used, needed more time with. I encourage you to think that way about your learner's work. When it comes to evaluations, most of us came up through a system where we were correct or incorrect, with the implication we were too lazy to do the work needed to get the correct answer. This is terribly unfair to the learner. No one learns everything the first time they're exposed to it. Correct or incorrect evaluations run counter to what it means to value learning. That mentality begs the question, is the acquisition of knowledge what's valued, or do we value the timeline for the acquisition? If using evaluations as a tool for scaffolding learning, then a timeline approach is problematic for learners who are struggling and for those who need more challenge. Before you start evaluating, it's important to have clarity on what you'll be evaluating. Start by choosing a limited number of new tasks. I recommend 2 or 3, but this depends on the student and the cognitive load the student is capable of handling. Do not overload a student with the number of new tasks or information being evaluated. That is overwhelming. It causes stress and anxiety, 2 things that negatively impact academic work. Cognitive load is an important reason why I recommend you pay attention to how your child best accesses and processes information. When you're checking for understanding, you want to make sure that it's done in a situation that is the best case scenario for them as far as diagnosing learning. This is something I haven't talked a lot about in the past, and so I decided to use myself as an example of how this can cause problems. I have tinnitus. That means I hear sound 24/7 inside my head. My brain creates the sound. Crickets are always chirping at the height of summer in my head. I'm serious about that, even now. On top of that, I had a lot of ear infections when I was a kid, and I have a lot of scar tissue in my ears, and I don't hear very well. An oral exam without the opportunity for me to read the words or have visual cues as they're spoken would be a terrible way to check for my learning, because the cognitive load when I'm trying to process auditory information is much greater than any other way you could present material. In fact, the reason I started turning off my camera during talks is that because of my hearing issues, my brain trained itself to key in on visual cues. So during talks, it was distracting to have myself up in the corner on camera. If you have a child who is neurodiverse in any way, I recommend you to be very thoughtful about the delivery method when evaluating for learning. I recommend you also include a holistic component when focusing on the bigger picture. This shifts the emphasis from static scores to measuring individual growth and improvement over time. Too often, evaluations ignore the positives and only focus on the new tasks. This is where students might think the evaluation is nitpicky. It's a good idea to always start with some positives that focus on what the learner has mastery of, and there are always positives. Evaluations that use both a task-oriented and a holistic approach is growth mindset in action. A growth mindset does not just push forward. It acknowledges the amount of progress and growth it took to get where an individual is. It's like think of it as the leaves on a flower. The leaves look down at the roots and the stem saying, thank you for raising me up so I can get sunlight. And it looks at the flower and says, oh, yay, we're going to make more. Your evaluations can help you understand a student's current level of understanding. For this, you can tailor instruction. If you're thinking, Blair, that sounds like a lot of work. How am I ever going to figure out what skills should come next? Never fear. I recommend you use a mastery approach about evaluations that I'll cover in just a couple slides. But first, I should add evaluate and teach learning skills. But teaching learning skills is something I've spoken about extensively. And if you want more information, check out the Learner's Toolbox series. So I'm not going to talk about those today. I want to talk about evaluating this today. I would argue that being skilled at learning is not just beneficial, it's essential for anyone who aspires to be a lifelong learner. Learning skills empower individuals to thrive in a constantly evolving world by providing the tools needed for accessing and processing information from diverse contexts. As a part of nurturing your children to become skilled learners, we need to intentionally teach these skills in a focused and age and stage appropriate way. For the purpose of nurturing for the growth of a skilled learner, it helps to break down the individual skills and treat each as a fairly complex learning task, because they are. If you're thinking, for example, I want to help my child have better executive functioning skills, it's important to break those into the individual skills and work on them one at a time. As with academic subjects, the cognitive load makes working on more than one or two at a time overwhelming. As you develop a philosophy for evaluations that supports your philosophy for how learning best happens, take into account how you will evaluate learning skills, as if your students are taking a class in this skill. Provide the same sort of feedback, mentoring, and modeling as you would with academic work. All. Let me say that again. ALL, capital letters. Feedback should be constructive and personalized. This is your child. You are nurturing their growth. If you're disappointed or worried about their progress, take a deep breath and let that go. Choose positives from a holistic and task-oriented perspective, and then make notes about next steps to focus on. Don't just think in terms of what evaluation looks like. Think also about how you speak to your child when evaluating work, and make sure the language you use, both in spoken and in writing, is positive in statement and tone. This is where it can be helpful to use the mental picture of a map. A map shows you the huge number of places you can go next. A growth mindset is like an internal compass where you view evaluations as learning opportunities that have direction. If you think of evaluating work as grading, you might want to be careful that you're not using what I call a red pen mentality, where you're primarily looking for and focusing on what your learner has missed instead of balancing that with everything they did achieve. When you evaluate work, this is really easy to do. This focus on errors is counterproductive to a learner-centered education designed to honor the unique intellect of each individual student. And none of our students, none of our children deserve a one-star review, ever. A mastery approach. A mastery approach for learning is an instructional strategy and educational philosophy that emphasizes individual student understanding and competency over standardized pace or time constraints. It ensures a solid foundation for future learning and avoids gaps in knowledge. It incorporates personalized learning and support, ensuring all students have the opportunity to master the content. And this is the heart of the approach that I recommend. If you want to know what I recommend you use for evaluations, it's this approach. Here's how it works from the standpoint of evaluating work. A student completes an assignment. This can include a test, it's any assignment. You look it over, evaluating for specific tasks that you already plan on evaluating their work for. You also evaluate for those areas where the student demonstrates mastery of learning. This is a positive measure of progress that helps your students see themselves as an active learner. And hey, you should be able to pat yourself on the back because as their person who is facilitating this individual's education, you were in part responsible for their learning. If your student misses anything that you thought they had mastered, it is not a reason to be frustrated with the student. It simply means mastery wasn't achieved. It's an important diagnostic for you as learning builds on prior learning. Therefore, it's an indication you need to take more time with those skills and concepts. You weren't done with them. You passed through that way too quickly. Next, give your learner feedback. Do not use a red pen mentality when you do this. With a mastery approach, you care about learning. And if you're teaching it, then it must be important enough to learn it. Anything that students miss, you should give them the opportunity to learn and resubmit their work. That means your feedback does not include the correct answer, by the way. Any student that takes the time to learn something the second or the third time, oh, I didn't know that. And then takes the time to go and learn it, and then resubmits their work, you should be really proud of them because that is the student who has taken control of their learning. It's a powerful statement from them about how much they value learning. By using a mastery approach, you are also modeling the value you place on learning. A study conducted by the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK showed there to be significant benefits when using a mastery approach in K through 12 classrooms. This graph was created by me, but I used their data. What it shows is that when a mastery approach is used at the end of a typical school year, K through 4 students were 8 months ahead on average of students in classrooms where a mastery approach wasn't used. That's pretty dramatic. In grades 5 through 12, a mastery approach led to students being 3 months ahead. That's still pretty dramatic. That's an entire semester. The benefits were most significant in math and science. However, the benefits in reading were also substantial. The information for subjects, the reason these numbers look a little different is it's an average across all grades K through 12. A mastery approach does use evaluations, but only as a diagnostic tool to help an educator determine where on the map of learning they're headed next. Students who master the material before moving on are more likely to retain information and have a deeper understanding of the content for the long term. Students also feel an accomplishment when they master challenging material, which can motivate them to learn. By providing additional support to students who need it, mastery learning can help close gaps in understanding. By implementing a mastery approach to evaluations, you create a learning environment that prioritizes deep understanding and the growth of the learner over grades and a timeline, even though grades do benefit. Including your learner is another important strategy for evaluations that nurture growth. Students should know what is being evaluated, especially if things outside of the scope of the academic discipline are part of the evaluation. As an example of how this might work, if you're evaluating a math assignment, be very thoughtful if you are also going to evaluate for handwriting. If the legibility of numbers is a part of what you're evaluating, students should know that ahead of time. If this is a problematic area for students, maybe their fine motor skills are something you want them to work on, understand that this is a learning skill that should be included when you think about the number of skills you're having your learner work on at that time. Involve learners in setting goals for improvement and in the evaluation process. As a part of this, be thoughtful as you set learning goals, and if possible, bring your student into the conversation. I say be thoughtful because if a learner has a lot of things that they could be working on, you don't want them to choose from 10 different tasks what to work on next. You should choose that for them because that's too many tasks, or you should give them 4 or 5 and say choose 3. As if you Give them 10. For many learners, it can have a negative effect on learning as they realize there are so many things yet to learn. A mastery approach to evaluations where learners are given the opportunity to resubmit work based on scaffolded feedback that doesn't include the answer is an important way to bring your learner into the learning process. When I used a mastery approach with high school chemistry students, I told them I was putting them in control of their grades. But they're high school students, so those grades went on their transcript and their learning is a part of that. It was pretty cool, I think, to give high school students the opportunity to be in control of their grade. They just had to do the work of going back and spending more time learning some concepts. One of the hardest things to deal with as a homeschooler is when your child has anxiety about evaluations. I went back and forth about the image to use for this slide, whether I should choose a nurturing image or one that's true to the anxiety some children feel. I decided to choose a slide, as you can see, that went with anxiety. Whew. Evaluating is made even more challenging when you think about the fact that everyone is evaluated in some way at some point. As a parent, you can control it until they leave home, but you can't control it afterward. It's also challenging because we work to create a situation for our children where they don't need to feel anxiety. If your child struggles with anxiety around evaluations as mine did, acknowledging their feelings and then thoughtfully helping them work through the anxiety can be an important strategy, and stay as supportive as you can in a way that doesn't exacerbate their anxiety. When evaluating a child who has anxiety, even if it's fairly low levels of anxiety, always keep in mind that anxiety affects performance. If you believe that your child's anxiety is affecting your ability to diagnose for understanding, find those evaluative methods that minimize anxiety. Do not feel that because the curriculum has a multiple choice test, that that's the only way you can evaluate if your child learned the material. You can evaluate them by talking through the material and asking questions or having them write an essay about the topic. Whatever is most effective for diagnosing learning is the best method to use. Many children have performance anxiety that affects academic work. It can be beneficial for those children to have them focus on their academic progress in a holistic way. If you're dealing with anxiety, might feel like evaluations can never be positive catalysts that nurture growth. Over time, however, through your loving guidance and support, your child can grow to be able to operate in evaluative situations that maybe they never love, but at least they can function through. If your child will ever find themselves taking tests, it's a good idea to teach test taking as a learning skill. You can do this using curriculum that has tests built into it or one of those test prep organizations. I honestly think all kids that are going to have to take an ACT or SAT should get test prep. As with other learning skills, treat this as a class so that your child doesn't have cognitive overload. Learners with test anxiety who are going to find themselves in a situation where they need to take tests benefit from you teaching test taking skills. Talk to your learner about this and explain why you're doing it. If you have a learner who struggles with test anxiety, get input from them about how you can incorporate the skill building of test taking in a way that doesn't increase their anxiety and therefore decrease their performance on the test. Learners who qualify for accommodations should practice test taking with the accommodations in place. Evaluations should be learner-centered and honest about the student you're teaching. They should be thoughtful and form a philosophy that is consistent with your philosophy about why you are home educating your child. I encourage you to give a strong thought about incorporating a mastery approach. I've used it with my own child and in classroom situations, and it's pretty amazing what can happen when you put students in charge of their evaluations and their own learning. It's a wonderful way to deal with anxiety as well. In this way, evaluation should consistently celebrate progress and empower your child as a lifelong learner. I hope this episode helps you when you are evaluating your learner's work. If you have any questions about evaluations or you want a little help with how you might evaluate something,
pop it in the comments, or you can shoot me an email, because I know it's kind of can get sort of personal. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Thanks for being a part of our shared community.